And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Brownlee, the Francis Shapiro-Weitzenhoffer Professor Emeritus of 19th Century European Art. David is a historian of modern architecture, whose interests embrace a wide range of subjects in Europe and America from the late 18th century to the present. His scholarship has been recognized with 3 major publication prizes from the Society of Architectural Historians, the SAH, and the SAH named him a fellow in 2015 and established the David B. Brownlee Dissertation Award in his honor in 2020. Active in civic affairs, and Professor Brownlee served for 16 years on the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and he serves on the boards of the Design Advocacy Group of Philadelphia, the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia, the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, the Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation, and the Global Philadelphia Association's World Heritage City Project. In recognition of this incredible public service, he received the Wick Strickland Award and the Globee Lifetime Achievement Award of the Global Philadelphia Association. Among his many books and articles are several about Philadelphia and the Penn campus, including Building the City Beautiful, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I also want to take a moment here to draw attention to David's role as a long-time, deeply committed and highly valued friend of the Penn Museum. David was the creator and is still chair of the Penn Museum Advisory Board, now known as our Campus and Cultural Advisory Council, which has gathered campus and city arts leaders to advise the museum's director on matters of contemporary significance since 2008. He has also served on our board of advisors throughout that time and has, in general, offered unstinting support and advice throughout the museum's evolution and transformation. For this, David, we are truly grateful. I know that we're all looking forward to hearing from him on his topic, Building Monuments, Monumentalizing Buildings. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. David Brownlee. David.
It's lovely to be with you all on this beautiful evening. The weather outside is what I think we all imagine Philadelphia weather ought to be like all the time, and perhaps it's living up to it. I know I'm very grateful for the kind words that Steve just gave, and I want to say that I share with all of you, I know, a desire that we will all be back together in real life, face to face, in our beloved museum in the near future. I look forward to that as much as all of you do. But for the moment, I'm glad to meet you in this virtual realm. It's lovely to be with you this evening to talk about the ways that we make monuments and the ways that we use monuments as part of the way that we remember things. As we reemerge after a year of medical quarantine and moral reckoning, I bet you are thinking, as I am thinking, about how we will process, about how we will remember these last few months. I think that there are lessons to be learned from 4 buildings designed by Philadelphians that were built to mean something and have come to mean other things. City Hall, Independence Hall, the Art Museum, and the National Assembly Building of Bangladesh, which was designed by the Philadelphian Louis Kahn. My main point, which I hope that you'll find to be liberating, is that what monuments mean is largely something that is decided by and changed by those of us who see and use them, by us. And the best monuments accommodate that very well. First, Independence Hall, which was, of course, built initially as the State House in the 1720s, from which the colony and then the state of Pennsylvania were governed. And I want to acknowledge here my indebtedness to the scholarship of Charlene Meares, who's written a wonderful book about Independence Hall. The silhouette of the building is part of the familiar iconography of Philadelphia, and it was often paired with the perhaps even more iconic ideal grid plan that was established for the city in 1683 that you see on the right. It was combined and paired by map makers such as Nicholas Scull and George Heap in their 1752 map of the city, which combines this map of the city with a view of Independence Hall, as you see. The same was done by Matthew Lauter in his map of 1777. But in truth, the State House wasn't really very prominent. And its form wasn't really very distinctive either. It's the little spire at the left in the panorama on the top from 1754, and the site is circled at the upper left in the 1762 street plan, which shows that it was really on the edge of town. The much taller spire and the circle located close to the young city's real center at 2nd and Market Street at the bottom center, that spire belonged to a much more impressive building, to Christ Church, that was built at roughly the same time on 2nd Street. It was built in the style that the great Christopher Wren had invented when he got to rebuild 51 medieval churches following the Great London Fire of 1666. The hallmark of his design solution for these churches was the steeple, a multi-storied stacking up of little classical pavilions designed to do the signaling work that Gothic spires had done in the city before the Great Fire. What Edmund Woolley, the carpenter builder of Independence Hall, did when he got the commission to create a building for a new kind of legislative assembly, what he did was to borrow the steeple from a Wren church and put it on top of a big house. Put, say, the spire of Wren's St. Mary Le Bow in London on top of this wonderful brick house from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That is what Independence Hall is. It's a church on top of a house. And it's safe to say that it wasn't designed to serve or to symbolize the kind of radical revolutionary republic that would be born inside its walls. An event that was recorded and monumentalized by the London-based American painter John Trumbull, who began to work on this heroic group portrait of the makers of the Declaration of Independence. He began painting it in 1786. We'll come back to this painting, but it's important to note here that at the same time that Trumbull was starting his painting, the Boston architect Charles Bulfinch was inventing a new purpose-made architectural embodiment of democratic government in the Massachusetts State House that you see on the right, a domed building in a full-blooded classical style. And that, after that, taking Bulfinch's suggestion further, when the competition was held to design the new Capitol building of the United States in the 1790s for Washington, D.C., the choice came down to two very similar derivatives of the ancient Roman pantheon, a domed building. In other words, at the time the Declaration and Constitution were being created, the steeple was not seen as a satisfactory symbol. And Independence Hall was not seen as a monument. A domed building was preferred. Indeed, not much attention was paid at all to the steeple and tower of Independence Hall. And by this time, it was falling down. On July 4th, 1776, the tower was judged to be too weak to allow the bell to be rung in celebration. And in 1781, the tower was actually torn down. It was in this dilapidated building that the Continental Congress governed the new nation in its first years, and it was here that the Constitution was drafted. And it was in the two wings that were added to the old building in the 1780s to serve as Philadelphia City Hall on the left and the Philadelphia County Courthouse on the right. It was in these wings that the new institutions created by the Constitution, the Supreme Court, the Senate, the House of Representatives, it was in these buildings, these borrowed buildings, that those institutions more or less camped out in the 1790s when the capital of the U.S. was Philadelphia and the city of Washington was under construction. I think of Charles Barley's city plan of 1796, made during this period when Philadelphia was the capital of the nation, with its vignette of the of the unheroically unsteepled State House, I think of this as the record of Philadelphia's they got us moment. Independence Hall is shown truthfully, and the reddened blocks on the east side of the map at the right show that only about a quarter of the visionary gridded city had actually been built. 4 years later, in 1800, in fact, the federal government left, as planned, and went to Washington, D.C. And somewhat more surprisingly, the state government also departed, first for Lancaster, and then for Harrisburg. The state put the building and the entirety of Independence Square up for sale in 1816, with the intention of allowing private development to fill in what was still the city's only properly maintained park. There was an outcry and a mustering of funds, and the city was able to buy the building and the land and protect them in 1816. And the city and the county made the most of made most of the and the city and the county used most of the multi-building complex for its offices and courtrooms in the early 19th century. But the top floor, the part marked in yellow here, including the long room, which had been the venue for all manner of public entertainments and celebrations in the 18th century, the long room was taken over by the painter Charles Willson Peale for his famous path-breaking comprehensive museum of human history and the natural world. Like the live animal exhibits were in fact maintained outside in Independence Square. The museum occupied these rooms for a quarter of a century, until 1827. And it might have been as the birthplace of the modern museum that Independence Hall was chiefly celebrated, if it was not for the fact that in 1824, General Lafayette, on his long farewell tour of the United States, visited Philadelphia. The last living hero of the Revolution, Lafayette his visit aroused a new sense of the historicity of the American experience. We see him here inspecting troops in New York in 1825, and a sampling on the right of the specially made souvenirs for his visit. And here he is in Philadelphia at the old steepleless State House in September of 1824. The Greek Revival architect William Strickland designed a temporary triumphal arch that was erected on the occasion, as you see, and you see that the souvenir handkerchief at the bottom calls the building, I've marked it in yellow, Independence Hall, one of the first uses of that term for the building. It was now that a building that was really a hashing together of unrelated old-fashioned symbols, and which had been neglected, and even when the great events were going on inside it, it was at this point that the building became a monument. And that really took some doing. The steeple almost seemed to cry out for attention, for being reestablished. And it was Strickland, the architect of the Lafayette Arch and of the Doric Greek Revival Second Bank seen behind him in his portrait, it was Strickland who got the job. It was not judged that the original steeple had been tall enough, and so a story was inserted. And clocks were mounted on all four sides of the tower. The building was thus made to look more like the important modern edifice that the audience expected that it should look like. They made it more like a monument. And then attention was turned to restoring the assembly room, which had been stripped and disfigured by its subsequent uses. There was, in fact, no accurate record, it was believed, of the original woodwork. But Trumbull's painting was judged to depict a room that was at least appropriate to the drafting of the Declaration and the Constitution. Notably, Trumbull, however, showed the cornice. Look at the upper right in this slide. Showed the cornice of the room in the upper right here, and again in the upper right here, as Greek Doric in character, represented by the Parthenon in Athens that you see on the left with a detail at the lower right. The putative birthplace of democracy, of course, was Athens. In the 1780s, this stylistic decision was very up to date. Greece had only been rediscovered by Western Europeans in the 1750s. And it's inconceivable that the original builders of Independence Hall in the 1720s could have done anything similar. In other words, Trumbull invented a monumental interior for the monumental events, an invented monument, making the assembly room look good enough for the history that had happened in it. Here's a view of the room in 1854. The making of that room, the making of the real room adequate for its symbolic purpose was assigned to another Greek Revival architect, the English-born John Haviland. His builder's assistant was the first American book to discuss Greek architecture, and I show you a page of it at the lower left. And with that knowledge of Greek architecture, and inspired by Trumbull's painted fiction of the assembly room, Haviland invented a stern Doric interior, the one that you see here, which, while Roman actually in many of its details, had a metopede frieze and a mutulled and gutide cornice that whispered Greek to the initiated. In short, what Haviland did, like Trumbull, was to invent an architecture that was noble enough to be an appropriate setting for the Great Proclamation of 1776 and the Constitution of 1787. In other words, he made a monument. Haviland's assembly room was what visitors saw when they came to Philadelphia for the Centennial exhibition in 1876. They also saw the iron columns that had been inserted to support the floor above. The Haviland-designed woodwork was repaired in the 1890s on the left when the iron columns were removed, and in 1951, the National Park Service took over management of the building, which continues to belong to the city of Philadelphia. The National Park Service stripped the woodwork of its paint and began to study what many still believed was in large part genuine 18th century work. That was how effective Trumbull and Haviland had been in casting a spell. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, though, in a painting begun by Robert Edge Pine and completed and engraved by Edward Savage. Like Trumbull, they show the dramatis personae of 1776. But Pine, who was working in America, knew the actual room in which the performance occurred, and he depicted an Ionic, not a Doric interior. When the National Park Service began to disassemble the woodwork, they found corroborating evidence. Only a few tiny pieces dated from the 18th century. And so they removed but preserved the Haviland paneling, which was itself now deemed to be historic. This allowed it to be reused in the elevator lobby when the old Litt Brothers department store was renovated as the Mellon Independence Center in the 1980s. The assembly room was now given a second reinvention by the National Park Service, which most people are convinced comes about as close as it's possible to come to the appearance of the space in the 1770s and the 1780s. When reopened in 1965, its noble airs and ancient affectations had been removed, and it seemed more like the kind of room in which fallible and complicated and ordinary 18th century humans might espouse revolution but embrace compromise, might proclaim universal human rights but reject the immediate abolition of slavery. The heroes still have a place, however, in the gigantic Trumbull painting that hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol. It's the painting in the center here in Washington, D.C. For good and for ill, monuments like the painting and the version of the assembly room that is now in Litt Brothers, monuments are not always about truth, but about aspiration. Philadelphia City Hall offers another opportunity to examine the way that monuments are defined really by the will of the people. When William Penn's surveyors laid out the city of Philadelphia and also its hinterlands, they produced this map, which shows the city of this capital city, the grid plan city, in an inset at the top, which I've tinted blue. And I've also vignetted it, pulled it out, and placed it at the left. This miniature representation of the Philadelphia grid plan shows at its center, in Center Square, a group of buildings that Penn designated for the governing institutions of his colony. And indeed, a meeting house was erected there by the Quakers. But the people chose to settle a mile away, jammed onto a few streets close to the Delaware River. It was too far to walk all the way to the meeting house. And so they rejected the rather abstract notion of and symbolism that Penn had proposed of a rational, orderly city governed from its center. They rejected this. They dismantled the meeting house and re-erected it at 2nd and Market Street, just a block from the Delaware River. The painting on the left shows a later version of that meeting house on the site as it stood in the 1750s. To the right, in the center of Market Street in the vignette and circled in the panorama, is the first city hall of the city, erected in 1707, when Penn ended personal rule over the colony and allowed the city to govern itself. Attached to the city hall and running westward down the center of what was soon called Market Street were the market sheds that you see depicted in the view on the right. The city government thus tapped the legitimizing presence of the merchants, the Quaker establishment, whose meeting house was across the street, the rising Anglican elite, whose Christ Church was just 100 feet north up 2nd Street, and for good measure, the Royal Arms Tavern stood opposite the meeting house on the north side of Market Street. This symbol, made of the stuff of real life, not of some abstract geographical positioning, this symbol was potent, but its potency came at a price. The city's offices were tiny. The city's offices were tiny, and space had to be rented for other functions of government. And so in the 1780s, as we've seen, the city of Philadelphia built a town hall, and the county of Philadelphia built a courthouse at either end of the State House complex. Those spaces sufficed until 1854, when the state legislature allowed consolidation of the city of Philadelphia and the approximately 24 other municipalities of the county of Philadelphia. As a result, the 2-square-mile city that Penn had laid out in his grid plan, the red block at the center, grew to 130 square miles. And city council was rechartered as a bicameral legislature, clearly outgrowing even the new buildings at Independence Hall. In what follows, I am very much indebted to the scholarship of Michael Lewis, who's written a wonderful essay about the Victorian City Hall. The city called for proposals for a new city hall and a new courthouse in 1858. And the first out of the blocks was the versatile Samuel Sloan. He proposed replacing the two bookend buildings of the late 18th century with a new city hall and a new county courthouse that were bigger, but rather utilitarian structures that would have given Independence Hall a rather uncomfortable embrace. The scheme was okayed by the city, but the state now roiled the waters, establishing its own committee in 1860 and recommending instead that the two buildings be erected in Penn or Center Square, circled here in red, around which the city had begun to fill in. Notably, this would at last fulfill William Penn's vision that the city's government would be in the center of the city, fulfilling his vision of perfect symmetry and balance. A competition was won quite decisively by John Mcarthur in an early phase of his career, who proposed two handsome, if somewhat old-fashioned neoclassical buildings, which would have faced each other across a street because Broad Street and Market Street would be preserved, dividing the square into quarters, and these two buildings would occupy two of those quarters. When I look at this design, I can't help but think of the City Hall and the big Protestant church that face each other across the Market Square in Karlsruhe, a city with a number of Philadelphia connections, including, probably most notably, the Karlsruhe-trained architect Gustav Runge, whose Academy of Music had just opened in 1857. But this project was not to be. When MacArthur was also awarded the construction contract to build the new buildings, there was uproar about double dipping and graft, and then the Civil War put an end to the discussion. After the war, the city once again took charge of the project, and the site was shifted back to Independence Hall. There was another competition in 1869, and MacArthur was again the winner. But this time his design, and all of the other competition designs, was in the newly fashionable mansarded style of Second Empire Paris. The actual competition design is lost, but this slightly revised version shows Independence Hall flanked by what appear to be two big mansarded houses, which are the ends of the arms of a huge C-shaped building that fills the entire square and lifts a landmark tower, notably, at its south facade. But the site debate wasn't over. Many saw this design, like Sloane's design, as unsympathetic, to say the least, to the small 18th century building, whose historic character was now beginning to be recognized. You might say it had recently been constructed. The state was back in the picture again, and in 1870, the state decided that Independence Hall had to be left alone, and that the public should be given the right to decide the site for the new city hall. And the choice should be between Washington Square, catty corner to Independence Square, and Center Square, or Penn Square, which since 1860 had been crossed by the tracks of the Pennsylvania, but since 1850 had been crossed by the tracks of the Pennsylvania Railroad on Market Street, as shown in these photographs, which also show, tinted blue, the Greek Revival Mint on the south side of the square, and the Masonic Temple, then under construction in 1868, on the north side of the square. There would be no more competitions. MacArthur was now given, having won twice, the job of designing a building for each of the two sites. This is his for Penn Square, which surprised the pundits by winning the state-mandated referendum in 1870. Penn Square won 51,623 votes to 32,825, closer than the Arizona primary. For real estate investors and commercial interests, the site decision was one of money, but when given to the public, the decision seems to have been made by symbolism. The unforgettable symmetry of Penn's grid plan had never been forgotten, and it demanded a building, a monument to its greatness and rationality, right at its center. And now, finally, the public actually chose the symbol for themselves. MacArthur was formally appointed to build the building on Center Square on January 1st, 1871. And in striving to create a monument that fulfilled the great promise of its location, rising at the physical and symbolic center of America's greatest industrial city, the workshop of the world, in striving to do that, he aimed to make it a composition of superlatives. But the building would take 30 years to complete. MacArthur would die 11 years before it was finished. And the dream of a monument based, and some of its superlatives, were all eclipsed and clouded by the passage of time. Not many of you, I suspect, know that, for instance, Philadelphia City Hall was the tallest building on Earth until 1908. But it was. It's not clear exactly how the skyward development of the building took shape, but this series of perspectives show the increasingly great height of the tower that was proposed to be built. I think that the resumption of the long-delayed construction of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. In 1876 must have been a factor, although in the end, City Hall at 548 feet is 7 feet shorter than the Washington Monument in D.C. It needs to be said, however, that the Washington Monument is not really a building, and nor is the Eiffel Tower, for that matter, and that's why City Hall is the tallest building. There was remarkably little fanfare, though, about this achievement. although anyone with an eye could have seen the enormous skyward leap that the tower had made in the development of the design between what was envisioned at first on the left and what was depicted on the left when it's seen being, in fact, overshadowed by neighboring churches, and what was proposed in the 1880s on the right. City Hall is largely a building of conventional load-bearing masonry, and for its tower to attain that height, the stone foundations, I show you a detail plan on the left, had to be enormously thick, and its upper stages had to be lightened by building them out of iron, a wrought iron frame and with cast iron panels. I don't want to give you the impression that no one noticed City Hall, but many factors worked against its recognition. By the time it was completed, its construction system was entirely obsolete, superseded by the steel frame, which in Philadelphia, too, had been widely used by the time City Hall was completed in other buildings. Other buildings shown in the 1890s panorama on the left, in which City Hall is shown outstripping all of its peers. It does stand tall, too, among its international competition in the poster on the right-hand side, which highlights the Singer Building, which in 1908 was the first building to rise taller in New York City. And it's fair to say that after this, the race to the sky is really a story of New York City skyscrapers. To be sure, City Hall's accomplishment was probably diminished by the slowness with which it was achieved. It reached its full height in 1894, but that was 23 years after construction had begun. Imagine what a swift construction schedule would have done for the building's stature. It was at that date in 1894, incidentally, that the big statue of Penn was put on the top. City Hall was also rivaled and perhaps overshadowed by other gargantuan things in the mighty industrial city of Philadelphia, most prominently the huge Broad Street Railroad station of the Pennsylvania Railroad, located just across the street from City Hall to the west. The station had been enlarged by Frank Furness and given a new train shed by the Wilson brothers in 1892 to 93. At 300 feet wide, the train shed was the largest permanent room on Earth, standing across the street from the world's tallest building. Maybe Philadelphia just had too many big ideas. There were other superlatives that Mcarthur conjured up in trying to make a monument. It was the largest load-bearing masonry building on Earth, the largest government office building until the Pentagon. But City Hall hid its hugeness. On the outside, what appear to be single stories are actually 2 stories, with 2 more tucked into the roof, so that an 8-story building looks much smaller. And because the building was gradually occupied while still under construction, city employees first moved in 1877, the mayor moved in 1889, the city councils moved in 1895. Because of this, there was no single dramatic opening of the new building. The floor plan, too, disguised its size. With its myriad small rooms to serve the functions of the county court system in every city department, the layout lacks a sense of hierarchy and grandeur. Divided into quarters by the intersecting streets, the axes of Broad and Market Street pass through the building. The building also has no single grand entrance, but 4. These are usefully but unimpressively placed at the corners, where octagonal stairs with spectacularly cantilevered stone treads spiral endlessly upward, with ingenuity, but perhaps without a sense of climax. On the other hand, some things just seem too big, without grand effect. The mayor's office, with its gorgeous fireplace, is now so big that it's used as an event space. And inside the base of the tower, and between the 2 council chambers, originally rose a 4-story conversation hall, into which a floor was later inserted, creating 2 gigantic rooms, one the caucus room. Imagine how great and how huge the space was originally. This giganticism wasn't just architectural. Until 1919, Philadelphia City Council was bicameral, as I said, with a common council that had a peak membership of 149 members and a select council of 41. These are their meeting rooms. City Council today of 21 members rattles around in the old Common Council chamber. And this gigantic cadre of Victorian politicians was not famous for their gigantic accomplishments, but for their gigantic nest-feathering corruption. This is the enormous Common Council photographed at one of its last sessions in Independence Hall in 1893, before the move to the new building. I'm not sure I know what a corrupt politician looks like, but I'm sure that there's some that can be spotted in this crowd. Indeed, so notorious was Philadelphia's Republican political machine that the muckraker Lincoln Stephan singled out the city for special opprobrium in his 1904 book, The Shame of the Cities. He called Philadelphia the worst governed city in the country and titled the chapter devoted to our city, Philadelphia, Corrupt and Contented. The slowness of Philadelphia City Hall's completion was also undermined its claim to be the latest thing in style, which might have helped to monumentalize it. It was clearly inspired by the enlargement of the Louvre Palace that was planned and undertaken by Emperor Louis Napoleon with head-spinning speed in the first years of his reign. Here, he and his wife are being shown the plans for the project in 1852, and here are the new blocks, complete just 5 years later. The signature feature of the so-called Second Empire style was the use of tall mansard roofs, with central and corner pavilions topped by vertically stretched versions of that roof type. Philadelphia City Hall has that in spades. City Hall's tower, I think, can be thought of as a supersized version of such a central pavilion. But by the time this was all put together in 1901, the new Louvre was nearly half a century old, and the Second Empire had been long ago replaced by the Third Republic. Taste had moved on. Among the most stunning and costly superlatives of City Hall is its enormous program of monumental sculpture, the work of the Scottish emigre Alexander Milne Calder. In many respects, too much attention is given to the gigantic bronze statue of William Penn, which was assembled on top of the tower in 1894, because it was just one part of a huge, iconographically rich program of sculpture. That being said, it must be noted that while virtuosic artistically, the sculpture is difficult to see without binoculars or a drone-mounted camera. Its meaning is often difficult to discern and sometimes troubling, and these days very outdated. For instance, the bronzes that join William Penn near the top of the tower are representations of indigenous peoples and Swedish colonists, presumably because it was they who preceded Penn in Pennsylvania. And here are the new, and here, I'm sorry, and the Broad Street passage that leads under the tower threads between four gigantic red granite columns whose capitals represent the diverse peoples of the earth. While all are shown capable of supporting the great load placed on their shoulders, implicitly the weight of the tallest building on earth, there are racial stereotypes that are disturbing. Such is also the case of the overarching themes of the central pavilions of each facade, the continents, whose personifications must have seemed like operetta caricatures even in 1900. But in any case, 8 stories above the ground, they are largely invisible. Thus, although superlatively large, tall, stylish, and richly ornamented, despite all of those things, by the time City Hall was completed, it was largely perceived as a difficult-to-understand, old-fashioned reminder of Philadelphia's corrupt politics. But it was seen to do one thing superlatively well, effectively, monumentally, and that was to mark the center of the big city with unmistakable clarity. A marker that until 1987 was at least the tallest building in Philadelphia. That is why the plans for the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which began to percolate at the time when the work began on City Hall, that was why it made a beeline from Fairmount to the tower. And that is why Paul Cray, the brilliant French head of Penn's architecture program, when he proposed tearing down City Hall itself and replacing it with a more modern office building in the 1920s, why he aimed to preserve the tower, either as is on the right or simplified on the left. This was so it might continue to serve as the physical marker and as the monument of the city's rational order and aspirations. It also served that function for it served that function for the new Parkway and also for Broad Street, which Penn and Home had laid out in 1683 and which had grown to be the longest straight street in the world during the period of time that City Hall was being constructed. It's that mighty, meaningful sense of order that parading mummers and Broad Street runners amplify with their actions. And it's worth noting that the mummers used to march up Broad Street from South Philadelphia towards City Hall. And it's one of the reasons that the so-called North Poles recently installed on North Broad Street are so unsuccessful. Because if you stand on the center line, they actually block the axial view of City Hall Tower, which is the one unambiguously monumental thing about the building. The symmetry that in 1870, Philadelphians voted to enshrine, to monumentalize. The construction of the new art museum on top of Fairmount was also a project of monumental intention. We'll spend less time with this, but like Independence Hall and City Hall, the most powerful meaning of this monument has been created by the people. Having said that, the awkwardly partnered architects Horace Trumbauer and Clarence Zanzinger, who barely spoke to each other, and their talented assistants, did create what are now called the Rocky Steps, a fertile field for the sowing of monumental meanings by the public. It must be noted that from the start, the steps were never seen as a functional necessity. The two firms set off on different tracks right from the start in 1911 when they were hired, but they were alike in minimizing the steps. And when Trumbauer's office developed the design for review in 1912, at the top, a retaining wall with an entrance at street level into the museum's basement has been introduced. This was probably the work of Trumbauer's chief designer, Julian Abel, Penn's first African-American architecture graduate. While big steps are back by the fall of 1912, at the bottom, they disappear again in the competing designs that the two offices created in 1914 to 1915, when the two turned to Howell Lewis Shea and William Pope Barney, 1913 Penn classmates, to study the problem in the two offices. Shea's design for Trumbauer at the top forgoes steps entirely. One would enter an elevator lobby in a very civilized way from the Parkway and whisk your way up to see the art. Barney below retains some steps, but also de-emphasizes them. To be sure, steps are back in the model that was approved by the model design that was approved by the art jury and put on display in City Hall at Christmas time in 1915. But they are gone again in the study that was made of the Parkway by the French landscape architect Jacques Grébert in 1917, when he was called in to consider how the great spaces might be turned into gardens. He depicted an art museum which has a retaining wall rather than a great stair facing the Parkway at the top. And it was thus that the plan was sold to the public in 1918 with an exhibition, with lectures, and special illustrated supplements in the newspapers like this in the Inquirer. The final decision on the steps only came in 1919, when they appear in these great perspectives by Julian Abel. The visually potent, vista-filling steps were not, however, judged to be an essential or even an attractive way to enter the building. The principal and preferred entrance, it was imagined, would be at street level. And in 1919, this was fixed on the north side of the building, where the great lobby and majestic vaulted tunnel reached by the entrance that I've circled in red on the right have just been refurbished and reopened after work by Frank Gehry. They would lead you to the elevators that would make the step climbing, that they would lead to elevators that made step climbing unnecessary. The steps are really the reverse of what they may first seem to be. They're not a practical way at least, to gain entrance to the museum, but they do terminate the parkway vista emphatically, and they are a splendid viewing platform from which to see the city, transforming it into a backdrop. But of course, the steps can also be a backdrop for a crowd facing the museum. In any case, the impracticality, the functionlessness of this most memorable architectural element of the design is in fact its vital feature. This was, of course, the point of its appearance in the movie that gave it its name, The Rocky Steps. Sylvester Stallone, as Rocky, ran up the steps in 1976 because they were an obstacle whose overcoming would be an accomplishment, not because, alas, they were a route to great art. And it is in this theatrical sense that the museum steps function in our society today, a place where what the sociologist Elijah Anderson calls a cosmopolitan canopy is unfurled over the diverse crowds who come to the Welcome America concerts and fireworks on the 4th of July, an event that began in 1993, and to the Made in America extravaganza that Jay-Z has orchestrated on Labor Day, beginning 9 years ago. The steps and the museum portico are now the defining, importance-conveying backdrop for the enactment of our religious beliefs, led by the Pope in 2015. And they are the site for us to express our secular desires as well, embodied in the NFL draft in 2017. So important is that backdrop that when the NFL stage was seen to cut off views of the actual museum portico, a styrofoam replica was built to stand in for the real thing on the stage. Of course, this is also where our community recently assembled to demonstrate our anguish and our aspirations. On May 30th of this year, Philadelphians gathered in the tens of thousands in front of the Art Museum steps at the head of the parkway to affirm that Black Lives Matter. I'm pretty sure that they did not choose that site because one of the architects of the building was African American, or because of the cachet of the museum's important African American collections, including paintings by Henry Azawa Tanner and prints by Doc Thresh. No, they gathered there because these were the Rocky Steps, perhaps because they symbolized anti-establishment achievement, but surely because these strong architectural forms have come to be associated with the recurrent gathering of our community, the assembly of our diverse selves. After hearing the speeches and kneeling for 9 awful minutes, the crowd moved towards Center City. But as they left this site more richly imbued with meaning, making it a more potent monument of our community's ability to effect change. Our final example of monumental making by the people is in the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka, where the National Assembly building, the parliament, is part of a district called Sher-e-Bangla Nagar, the city of the Bengal tiger. The strong, austere assembly building, which was commissioned in 1962 but not opened for 20 years, is simply the most effective piece of monumental architecture created in my lifetime. At a time when most people say they don't even like modern architecture, Bangladeshis love this building. It is the work of a Philadelphian, Louis Kahn, who died when the work was still far from complete. The success of the design is startling, for it is the Capitol building in a Muslim country designed by an Estonian-American Jew. And the design was initiated by Pakistan, when what is now Bangladesh was called East Pakistan. The construction was delayed by the Civil War, which ended in the establishment of Bangladesh in 1971. At that time, what had been designed to be the secondary capital of a geographically divided nation, which would occasionally host parliament and government leaders, it then became the capital of a new nation, designed by a foreigner of a different faith and commissioned by a government against whom the people of Bangladesh waged war, this building became a monument of national identity. How did that happen? I don't think there's a single answer, but there are some features of the story that I think are important. First, the building was literally under construction as the nation was being built. Its very slow rise, the product of an infinity of Bangladeshi toil, was like the painful birth of Bangladesh. And it involved the same actors. The nation and the building were indissolubly linked in the public consciousness. That is important. Second, and I think less consequential, the design was marked by Khan's voracious interest in everything that he saw. And he had recently seen and admired some of the great monuments of Mughal India. The 17th century architecture, whose most famous example is the Taj Mahal, a tomb like this one, Humayun's tomb, which is outside Delhi. The multi-layered walls of Mughal architecture, perforated with geometrically strong, darkly shadowed openings, and were almost surely of interest to Khan. And perhaps this historical reference was noticed by some Bangladeshis. Third, and very tellingly, Khan insisted on adding a mosque to the program for the building. And he built the four-towered prayer room over the entrance to the entire complex, which necessarily had to be canted a few degrees in order to be aligned with the Qibla, the direction of Mecca. You can see the mosque in the bottom of the plan, and you can see that it doesn't align with the axes of the main building. Thus did Khan compel everyone who entered the building to orient themselves toward their faith. And perhaps more significantly, he impressed on all how deeply he respected local faith and culture. But for all of its embeddedness in the history of the making of the nation, for all of its references to historical architecture, and even in its deference to the structures of Islam, for all of that, I think that the most potent component of the assembly building in Dhaka is its abstraction. This gives it the capacity to welcome and empower all those who visit. In this, it is like the useless steps of the art museum, the strong but quiet vertical marker that City Hall implants at the center of the city, and the architectural shell that Independence Hall offers up for interpretation and reinterpretation. Khan said that he liked buildings that looked like they were wrapped in ruins, like the double-skinned accommodations that he designed to create shady comfort for the MPs from West Pakistan when they visited Dhaka. Their simple brick walls resembled ruins, he said. And he said in 1965 that he liked ruins because ruins were freed from the bondage of use. By that he meant that they were freed from ordinary utilitarian functional requirements and were thus free to be symbols, free to be monuments. And that is clearly what Khan's Capitol building became for Bangladesh. It is the most common motif, most common symbol of nationhood on stamps and currency, as you see here. It is like the useless steps of the art museum where people come to protest and to celebrate political victories and to mark national holidays and just to gather on a green lawn at the end of the day after work. Dhaka is famous for its myriad pedicabs and the motorized taxi tricycles that are called baby taxis. They jam the streets and are the object of perpetual efforts to control noise and control pollution and increase safety. They are also canvases for artistic creativity. Favorite subjects are animals, gods and goddesses, and local landmarks. And among the latter, Louis Kahn's National Assembly is a favorite. I photographed this example from a regular four-wheeled taxi in 1990. And to prove that it's not a fluke, here's a photograph of another taken by another Khan aficionado somewhat more recently. And here is what Dhaka-based expat Judita Olmacher did with 8,000 Lego blocks in 2019. Now, I don't think that these responses are the result of the skillful manipulation of the audience by an architect. I think they are the creations of an audience that was inspired by strong and simple forms to think about important and complicated things and make the forms into monuments. And I think that architecture that makes us think is great architecture. In our lifetime, I think that that has been achieved most powerfully, even more powerfully than Khan's work in Bangladesh, by Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, that marvelously therapeutic wound in the earth, in which reflection, both metaphorical and real, is unavoidable. We need more monuments in spaces like this, which do not lecture us, but that challenge us to think afresh, both individually and as communities, and to make them into monuments. I think that we hear such challenges issued in the abstraction of Dhaka, in the practical uselessness of the art museum steps, in the uncomplicated geometric specificity of City Hall, and in the elastic reinterpretability of Independence Hall. If we want monuments, I think we have to make them for ourselves. And these buildings invite us to do just that. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer questions.